Hey everyone, welcome to the Rock Solid Apologia podcast, where we discuss Christian apologetics, worldviews, and so much more. On today's special edition of the podcast, we are joined by Christian apologist J. Warner Wallace. Now, let's begin today's episode.
Welcome to the world's one and only apologetic satire podcast. I am Micah, the host of Rock Solid Apologia, and joining me today is Will and Nick, also from Rock Solid Apologia. But forget about those guys. With us today is J. Warner Wallace from Cold Case Christianity. J. Warner Wallace is a Dateline featured cold case detective, author, speaker, senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and adjunct professor of apologetics at Talbot School of Theology, also known as Biola University, and Southern Evangelical Seminary. J. Warner Wallace's new book, Person of Interest, Why Jesus Still Matters in a World That Rejects the Bible, is available at booksellers everywhere. From the epic sarcasm of Tertullian to the funny retorts of Martin Luther, satire has been defending the faith since the way, the truth, and the life himself became incarnate. We provide rock-solid Christian truth along with rock-solid apologetic satire, all on rocksolidapologia.com. Welcome to the world's one and only apologetic satire podcast, Jim. It is fantastic to have you.
I think you do have that special distinction, right? That you are the only apologetic satire out there. So that's good. I'm glad to be with you guys.
Yeah, when we first started thinking about doing an apologetics website, it was like, how do we make our site unique? Because there's a lot of good apologists out there that will do it much better than we will. So how do we add something to it?
Well, I think if nothing else, look, you're absolutely right. I mean, part of this is that you have something unique, and all of us do, and it's about figuring out what that is. And one of the things that was so unique when I first met you guys at these reality conferences for student apologetics conferences is that you're probably amongst the youngest doing the case at all, making the case at all as apologists. So, and I think this is so important because that's one of the features of who you are. It changes, by the way. You won't always be this young. So now is the time to kind of leverage that aspect of who you are to reach a generation that maybe you can't be reached by people who are older. But then on top of it, you've added this kind of approach where you're kind of like the Babylon Bee of apologetics kind of websites. That's helpful too, right? Because you're also kind of niching in from that angle. So I think it's good that you're doing both.
And it's great to have you on to give us the beyond the satire. And we were looking at the site recently, and the judge has been in a bit of a dilemma, and we thought we could get your opinion as a professional cold case detective. Here's the latest from Rock Solid Apologia. Nick?
Confusion erupted recently after Roman Prefect Pontius Pilate was brought to trial for the murder of Jesus of Nazareth. Pilate pleaded guilty. The guilty plea was not surprising considering how many witnessed Christ's death. The Roman Prefect reminded the court that Jesus didn't stay dead and that manslaughter charges were not entirely accurate. An exception should be made in this case, Pilate argued. Before the guilty verdict was handed down, Islamic prophet Muhammad appeared and argued that Jesus didn't die in the first place. The court sided against Muhammad in favor of the multitude of witnesses who watched the crucifixion. In related news, JW founder Charles Taze Russell sued the court for getting the method of Jesus' execution wrong.
So the court has been unsure what to convict Pontius Pilate of after Jesus rose from the dead. So Jim, as a cold case detective who's been in court cases, what would you charge Pontius Pilate with in this rather unique situation?
Well, okay. So can you imagine, right? I mean, look, there are some, you can't really, if I'm honest with you, you can't really charge them with anything. And here's why, because there are certain justifications. Not every killing it's okay to kill in certain situations. I know that sounds crazy, but I'm in California, and I bet whatever state you're in, the laws have similar exceptions. There are certain justified homicides. And what justifies a homicide typically is one of three things. One, you are trying to save your own life. You can use whatever force is necessary to stop an attack on your life, up to and including deadly force. And we're not going to charge you with a homicide. That's a justifiable that not with a murder, because murder requires malice aforethought. That we would say that in this situation, you were justified in using whatever force was necessary to protect your life. Second one, if you're trying to save the life of an innocent, you see someone's trying to murder a child, you can use whatever force is necessary up to and including deadly force to protect the life of the innocent. We're not going to call that a murder. That's a justified homicide. Third, you are acting as the state. So you cannot, like, for example, go back and charge the governor of California with an execution, a death penalty execution. So Pilate's going to basically stand on that third one. Hey, can't charge me with anything. Now, whether he died or didn't die doesn't matter. That was within my legal right. I followed all the procedures you're supposed to follow. I could have executed anyone that way. And that is going to be an exception to the law. Now, I'm not sure what the laws were in Rome, but I'm pretty sure they probably were similar in that regard. So I think, honestly, I think it works great, though, for us to discuss, because all the stuff in your satire actually discusses key issues that are fun and important to talk about. But if we're honest about it, he's going to basically, because he's doing it on the third exception, he's not going to be charged with anything.
So he doesn't even need Jesus to rise from the dead to get out of it. The law will just do it.
That's right. That's right. The statute will do it. Yeah, you're right. You're right about that.
That's really interesting.
Right. So these are the exceptions in the law. And by the way, we have another one in California, which is even more disturbing. Okay. Here's the law. The law says in California that if you murder a woman who is pregnant, you are guilty of 2 murders. Mm-hmm. That's right. Even in California, the unborn fetus is seen as another human. You'll be charged with 2, unless the woman, the mother, agrees. That's the exception for abortion. So what they basically said in California is, if you kill a fetus in an act of murdering the mother, then you've got a double murder. But if you kill a fetus and the mother consents to it in an abortion, that's not a murder. So
Interesting.
So basically, the baby is only a human if the mother says so.
It seems like it's a form of moving. Oh, sorry. It seems like it's a form of moving the goalpost, if I'm being honest.
Well, and this is what I think is interesting, right? Because I think they recognize there's a moral conundrum here, right? If we're going to call the unborn a human for purposes of a crime, then how do we get around the problem with we're allowing abortion? As a matter of fact, when Roe v. Wade was overturned, California started to invite people. They want people to come here to have abortions, right. So they've got to have an exception in the law for this. But it just strikes me then that it's about the mother's consent to a murder. If the mother consents to the murder, it's not murder. And that's just another exception they've written in here in California. I'm sure that's not true in every state, but it's true here in California.
It's scary that it's even true in one state.
Yeah, I know. Well, and again, because we're looking at it in terms of, look, if I agree, it's not even so much, I think, like what worldview do I possess that brings me to a decision on one. It's about, is it even internally consistent, right? Like, are we going to have any consistency with this? And the idea, again, let's just run it forward a little bit. If it was a 3-year-old, let's say a 3-week-old infant, a baby, would it be okay and she's holding it in her arms when someone attacks her and both end up dying? Well, we've got double homicide. But could the mother kill a 3-week-old baby? This is why what it is in the womb is such an important question. It is the one fundamental question. What is it we are terminating? Because it's either a human or it's not. It's a human person. I think we can make a good case for it not just being a human, but being a human person. Personhood is also a feature that sometimes you'll see people who will argue, well, it might be human, but it's not a person. No, I think you could actually argue for human personhood as well. But anyway, now we definitely are rabbit trailing.
Yeah. So I know you've used the analogy of the jury to describe the eyewitnesses or the people trying to decide whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. How likely is it that the entire jury, to use that terminology, hallucinated seeing Jesus?
Well, okay, so I think it's easier. It'd be far, these kinds of claims about either somebody lying, or being motivated to lie, or having a hallucination. These are a lot easier to make when you just have a single observer. So to say, well, my motivation to lie was I was going to become rich. Okay, well, that's easy. Is everyone's motivation the same though? No, it's harder. Once we have 12 people involved, clearly you'd have to argue that every one of them got rich or every one of them got famous. If you said, well, Paul is lying about this because it made him somebody important, that's kind of ludicrous to begin with, because Paul was already important with the bigger group. Why would he leave the bigger group to go to this group and try to become important? But not everyone of the 12. I mean, most Christians can't even name the 12 because so many of them basically died anonymously with no fame as a result of this, no money, no power, no sex. Those are the three things that cause people to lie: money, sex, and power. And those are missing. You can't even name them. They basically vanished off the face of the earth, and Christians can't name the 12. So it turns out that most people, that's why when you start adding to the number, the argument becomes more difficult to sustain. Right. So if you're saying, well, one person could hallucinate it, well, they all had the exact same. Okay, what evidence do we have of mass group hallucinations where the details are all the same? That's the problem. So yeah, anytime you start adding numbers to the claim, then the idea that they lied about it becomes less and less reasonable, and the idea that they hallucinated it becomes less and less reasonable.
Have there been any recorded evidences of mass group hallucinations ever?
Well, there have been, you'll see that the people will talk about different saints in the Catholic tradition, that certain observations were made, single sightings. But that is that's very different than you could say, well, we all saw this UFO or something in the sky we couldn't describe. But that's not the claim that's being made in the Gospels. The claim in the Gospels is of distinct interactions in the upper room, conversations. There's where you get into trouble. There's nothing like it in recorded history that has this kind of detail. And remember, if we were writing these late in history, it's easy to write things that aren't true. But these were not written late in history. That's one of the reasons why I wrote Cold Case Christianity, was to try to show you why I believe these are written early based on the evidence. And that's where it's a little harder, because that means that these are being written at a time when everyone who saw Jesus for real could actually comment on whether these gospels were accurate or not. Remember, it's not just that you're writing them early enough so that they would at least have been written at a time when an eyewitness could have written them. It's also that they're written early enough so that if somebody who knows the truth and you're telling a lie can call you out as a liar. That's why it's so important for us to know if they were written early. So I think in the end, those are just, and by the way, guys, when anyone ever says to me, well, isn't it possible X? Isn't it possible Y? I always say yes, because anything is possible. And that's why that's so stupid. I don't care about what's possible. It's possible we are imagining this conversation right now. It's possible we're still sleeping. It's possible we're in a universe that is a computer simulation and none of us even really exist. That's at least possible, but we don't care about that. We care about what's reasonable, and that's very different. So when someone says, is it possible they're lying? Yes. Not reasonable, though. Is it possible they hallucinated it? Sure, but not reasonable.
So is it possible for God to create a rock so big he can't lift?
Okay, so I would say, well, it's possible, but it's not reasonable, in the sense that I could posit the question, and I suppose if you wanted to think about it, but what it comes down to is that we don't believe God does stupid things, okay? And creating a rock that's too big to lift is a stupid thing. And because our God is not stupid, we don't believe he does stupid things. So I think it's not reasonable for us to think that, right? These are logical inconsistencies. And because God is the father of logic, the logic is simply reflects his nature. He's like, if you put a salt in the water, it becomes salty. A pot of water, if you put salt in it, it becomes salty. We are in a universe that is God-bathed. And because we're in this universe, it tastes like God. There are moral truths that are a reflection of God's nature. He's in the water with us, and it reflects his moral truth. It also reflects the laws of logic, because he's like the pinch of salt. He's the pinch of logic that's in the soup. And so therefore we all recognize the laws. It's not that he creates the laws of logic. It's that they just reflect his nature, and he's in this with us. So I think that's part of what we're saying here is that, yeah, because that's a logical inconsistency, it is not possible because God is not illogical. That's why I always say we don't believe God does stupid things.
That seems to be a
Really
quote.
good.
God does not do stupid things.
Well, I mean, this is just, the nature of these kinds of claims. They're always going to say something
Mhm.
that is a logical inconsistency, the same way we would say that God does not do immoral things and he doesn't do illogical things. I kind of call that the category of stupid.
Yeah. So there's one other thing in this article.
Yeah.
How would you, as a cold case detective, react to Charles Taze Russell, the Jehovah's Witness founder, claiming that the court got Jesus's method of execution wrong? So he didn't die on a cross; he died on a
Which kind of
stake.
cross is it? Yeah. There's been a lot of talk about that. And this to me, I've written an article about it. I'm just going to pull it up here real quick. So I kind of have my view of it, and I try to base the view in the historical context of what is what kind of the debate you were talking about here is the debate about what kind of cross was.
Mhm.
It just a tree? Was it a T cross? Was it a regular cross that we talk about? And there are Latin terms. Cross of Jesus. I'm just typing in, by the way, on our Cold Case Christianity website, there's a search bar, and you can always just type in the search bar. And so that's where I typically will find. And this is called "What Was the Shape of Jesus's Cross?" is the article. What was the shape of Jesus's cross? And so basically what I tried to do is look at the biblical evidence for it and look at the historical evidence for it, and then land on which is it. Is it a crux simplex, just a simple tree, vertical? Is it a what they call a crux commissa, which is the T-shaped cross? Is it the crux immissa, which is a cross like we think of traditionally, as we see as Christians, the kind of cross you might wear on a chain? Or is it what we call as a crux decussata, which is like an X, so it's on its side like an X. So that's kind of the four versions that are possible, and it wasn't unusual for the Romans to use a variety of these, and historically others as well, to do crucifixions. So then the question becomes, okay, well, honestly, which one of these, and is this an essential? When I say that, I mean, is this the kind of thing that we all need to agree on the shape of this cross, and those who don't agree are not really saved? No, we would say this is a secondary issue, right? And so while I think this is interesting, I've written one article about it online, and it's only, to me, worth one article. I would not probably waste a lot of time arguing about this. If I've got a brother in Christ who says, well, I've got these biblical reasons, let me show you in the text. I've got these historical reasons, let me show you in history. And he makes a strong case for a different form of the cross. I'd say, well, good for you. It's one of the first questions we can ask Jesus when we see him. What was the shape of the cross?
Yeah, because it does not make any difference as
it doesn't
far
really
as
matter.
salvation goes.
That's right.
I really like that. That's nice.
So,
Well,
but
in
you'll see
Islam,
but I've tried to outline all of the evidence in that article that is usually offered. So, and just to see, so you can see why I'm landing it the way I land it. But I think that traditional shape is the most reasonable inference. And if I had to go to a second, I would say, just to be fair, that the evidence for the traditional shape is probably only slightly better and more reasonable than the evidence for the T shape. So I don't like split hairs. I don't like say, well, this is ridiculous for you to think there's a T shape. No, I think I fall on the side of the traditional cross, and I think the evidence is slightly better. But I think you can make a case for the T shape of the cross. And I think the least reasonable form is the other two, especially the simplex, just the tree, the vertical post. That's the least reasonable shape, I think, given the biblical evidence and the historical evidence. But anyway.
well, in Islam, they don't even have a cross to begin with. Surah 4, verse 157. And it turns out that recently, at least according to the world's one and only apologetic satire site, that Muhammad elaborated on his claim that Jesus never died and suggested that hot air balloons were used to rescue Jesus from the cross. Nick, what's the latest from Rock Solid Apologia?
Yes, recently out of Arabia, Islamic prophet Muhammad recently figured out just how exactly Allah rescued Jesus from his horrific death on the cross. It turns out that Allah, in his infinite wisdom, decided to use a hot air balloon. The Apostle Peter designed a hot air balloon and snatched Jesus, peace be upon him, off the cross before the Romans' very eyes, Muhammad told Muslims and Christians alike. Christians reminded Muhammad that hot air balloons were not an option for a first century fisherman. Muhammad pointed out that Peter, as a superstitious first century dude, did not know that hot air balloons had not been designed, but he invented one anyway. Jesus, peace be upon him, and his ascension was a happy accident. Muhammad concluded, Jesus floated into the clouds when Peter lost control of the hot air balloon, and Jesus was never seen again. At the publishing time, the Wright brothers had reached out to Peter for some tips on building their new plane, which I personally hope really gets off the ground.
So, how would you make a case that a murder has been committed, or an execution, probably is the more technical term, has been committed in the first place? How do we know that Jesus actually died?
Well, okay, so you know that so on the strength of evidence, in this case, it's eyewitness testimony, right? Somebody saw it and reported it. Now, you can argue, and this has been done before, that there are no eyewitness accounts. These are all written, hundreds of years later or decades later. Some version of that claim, or that they were written by somebody who was not an eyewitness. Now, look, I've looked at all those things. First of all, John's gospel, it appears, and even all these gospels appear to have been written by people who either saw this or heard about it from somebody who did. Luke tells us, I didn't see it. He saw the stuff in the book of Acts, but he tells us in his gospel, I was just, talking to and interviewing the servants of the word, the eyewitnesses and the servants of the word. Okay, great. But those claims then are being reported by somebody. Interesting, one of the claims is that water comes out of the body of Jesus while he's on the cross. He's punctured with a spear, and water comes out of his chest cavity. And I can tell you that pretty much every early commentary on John's gospel will say that is going to, and they'll use other verses to try to figure out how that can't be water. That is going to represent something. It represents either the baptism, it represents the Holy Spirit, it represents something. It can't be water, though. It's just figurative language used by John to represent something else. And the reason why I think they stretch and go that far, and you'll see this from Origen, Tertullian, a lot of these early church fathers, when they write about this, they'll describe the water as something other than water. Well, a lot of that's because they don't understand the biology of, if you suffer a heart attack or any kind of catastrophic heart issue, if you suffer a trauma that leads to cardiac arrest, you will suffer some form of effusion, which is where water collects either around your heart or in your lung. And if you are in the right position, upright would be the right position, you are likely to have water in your lung. And if I puncture that chest cavity, because you've already passed away from cardiac arrest and you now have suffered water collection, effusion, you will see the water drain out of the lung. And that, to me, it was a good reason to believe. And by the way, I just don't think that people understand what dead bodies look, feel, and how they respond. Like, we don't have a lot of experience with dead bodies. Not everyone does. Some people do. But if you've handled a dead body, it's really hard to mistake dead bodies for unconscious bodies. It really is, especially within 10 minutes, 15 minutes, maybe at the point of passing. A dead body still feels pretty supple, doesn't lose its body temperature, doesn't start to become rigid. The blood doesn't start to drain because of gravity into certain regions of the body. But I guarantee you, by the time they take Jesus's body off the cross, they're going to know if he's dead, because his feet are going to be swollen. They're going to be purple because his heart's not pushing blood anymore. That means that the blood's going to be drawn by gravity to the lowest portion of his body, still on the cross. He's going to be cold to the touch. And the hot blood is no longer flowing. He's going to start to get rigid. You're going to pull him off. He's not going to go limp immediately. He's going to be acting like a rigid. And this is just 3 forms of what happens, the 3 different conditions that happen to your body once you die. Now, if you've been around a lot of dead bodies, you see this. I can usually spot a dead body from across the room. I don't have to get up on it to know that guy's dead, because there's just, it's color too. Color right away changes because you don't have that flush you get with the blood. You get, it's called the mortis triad. It's rigor mortis, it's stiffening, it's all of these different forms of decay that occur pretty quickly, especially if as the scriptures say, that someone's got to ask for the body and then get permission from Pilate, like Joseph of Arimathea, who then goes and checks to see if he's dead, then comes back and gives permission to Joseph, who then says he went out and he bought linen. And then he got the body. Well, that's a period of time that's just too much. I mean, I just don't think that remember in the first century, everyone knew what death looked like because there were no coroners or morticians. You wrapped your own dead. So at some point you were going to see death. I don't think they would have been easily fooled. So I just don't think it's reasonable.
There's absolutely no evidence to suggest, as another satire headline reads, Jesus rushed to the hospital after surviving crucifixion.
Yes. Can you imagine what kind of hospital that would have been? So he's going to rush to the emergency room, right? An ambulance actually took him to the emergency room. There's not a lot of options in the first century for what were considered poor criminals hanging on crosses. So I think that he was lucky that he had a tomb to be buried in and people who were willing to even treat him at all.
Well, in the article, they had to substitute an ambulance for a donkey, and they had to substitute the hospital for Mary Magdalene's house.
Oh, there you go.
But there's one other piece we wanted to get your take on. Sure. World's one and only apologetic satire site has suggested yet another theory as far as the resurrection goes. The headline reads, revealed, Simon of Cyrene used Jesus' original hairspray to fool all 12 disciples into believing that Jesus rose from the dead. New research indicates that Simon of Cyrene stole Jesus' one-of-a-kind hairspray while carrying the cross and used it to convince the disciples that Christ had risen from the dead. Aha! I know that smell, John, son of Zebedee, announced excitedly after Simon of Cyrene picked the lock. The minute I got a whiff of that genuine Jesus smell and hair, I was convinced, Peter said while sniffing the air contentedly. Doubting Thomas, on the other hand, was not so easily convinced and had to pull Simon's wig off and sniff it for himself before believing in the resurrection. Once I removed the wig and put it up to my rather doubtful nostrils, I knew Jesus was back from the dead, Thomas declared excitedly. Publishing time, James, the brother of Jesus, declared that he would not be fooled by Simon of Cyrene's clever disguise unless he happened to be wearing Jesus's deodorant as well. So how would we go about showing that the disciples were not deceived by an imposter? Like, Simon of Cyrene.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. I think Simon of Cyrene that's a good, so here's what it comes down to. Most con artists require certain criteria to be a good con artist. And we've kind of used that expression con man or con artist. And we've lost where that word even comes from. Like, what do we mean when we use con? Well, the word we use for con is just short for confidence. A con artist is a confidence artist. In other words, he's somebody who knows the people he's conning so well that he has their confidence. They trust him. He also has to have a second quality. He has to know the material better than the people who he's trying to con. So, for example, if you're trying to con me on Charles Ponzi he invented the Ponzi scheme, and he would convince donors or investors that they were investing in a company. And in the end, he would take their money and give a portion of it to the next investor as a return. So they would think this company is doing pretty well, but he's just actually moving money around and taking money from people, and there's no company. But you'd have to know something about how companies operate in order to fool somebody who knows nothing about how companies operate. And that's why they were stupid enough to give you the money to begin with. Here's what it means. It means you need those two things: the confidence of the person you're lying to, and you have to know more about the thing you're lying about than they do. And there's the problem with any of these confidence schemes when it comes to Jesus. Simon of Cyrene you need to know everything that Jesus has said to us, because you're going to start repeating that stuff to convince us you're him. You're going to have to know how he expresses himself and how he moves and how he holds his hands, because you're going to want to do it the same way. You need to know it's going to be somebody from the inner circle, because anyone who's outside the circle wasn't with him. Remember, most of those conversations that he has with the people you're trying to fool were held in private. There's no 13th guy. So who's it going to be? That's number one. Number two, so you got to know him better than the people you're fooling. I just don't see a good candidate. It's worse than that, though. On the backside of the resurrection, you have a Jesus who is incredibly supernatural. He does all of the supernatural things that Jesus did before the crucifixion. He performs miracles. He eventually is going to ascend into heaven. How am I going to get that part to work? I mean, the claims are either false on the backside, or you're dealing with something other than a con man. And that's why I just don't think it's reasonable. But remember, anytime anyone says to me, well, could the disciples have lied? Is that possible? Yes. Not reasonable. Well, could they have hallucinated this? It's possible. Not reasonable. Could there have been a con man? It's possible, but it's not reasonable. So I'm never going to be so emphatic about it that I could say I cannot imagine a possible scenario in which this could be. Of course. I mean, anything is possible, but that's just a stupid question because it doesn't really help us come to any conclusions. Remember, in criminal trials, there's a standard of proof. The standard of proof is not beyond a possible doubt because we could never reach it. The standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a lower standard. And why? Because we have a jury instruction. Judges tell juries that I could level a possible or imaginary doubt against anything you believe. That's why the standard is not possible doubt. The standard is reasonable doubt. That's a lower standard. Now, it turns out that most people are willing to embrace that lower standard for everything in their life until it comes to God. And now they have to be way beyond a possible doubt. Why? Well, there's nothing you know in your life beyond a possible doubt. Name something you think you know beyond a possible doubt. Oh, I know I exist. Really? There are philosophers out there who are convinced you don't exist, that you are simply a computer simulation. Well, there's a version of you out there. It's all digital. You just think this is part of the simulation. I mean, I can level a possible doubt against any claim you think is true. And that's why we don't try to aim at possible doubt as our standard. Reasonable doubt's good enough.
Yeah, and it seems to me like when I research, especially on credibility of the Bible, if it were any other ancient text, they'd give it a little bit more lenience. But because it's the Bible, we can't take anything in there. We have to have hyper skepticism towards everything just because it's the Bible and it comes from the Bible.
Well, you see this also too now.
If the same...
Go ahead, Nick.
Oh, sorry, sir. If the same standards were applied, that would eliminate virtually half of recorded history.
Well,
if
exactly.
I'm not mistaken.
I mean, how about this? I mean, if you're going to argue that we cannot use, I hear this all the time. Well, you can't use eyewitness hearsay evidence. All this is hearsay. You don't have access to those people to ask them directly what happened. You're just taking it on. So hearsay is like if there's a murder and you come into court and say, my sister told me she saw it and this is what happened. I need to talk to your sister. She's the eyewitness. I can't cross-examine you. You're going to say, oh, I don't know. My sister told me. No, I need your sister because everyone in court has the right to cross-examine their accuser. So for court purposes, we must have the person who actually saw it to interview. But we don't do history this way. And most skeptics would never flinch at what they think they know about Einstein. But you can't get that. You're going to have to trust somebody else for it because he's not here to interview anymore. These are things that the history of Darwin, they're going to trust that. But so in the end, when we're doing history, the standard is not, the hearsay standard has to go because the hearsay standard is an unreasonable standard that we have created. We know it's unreasonable. We want it to be unreasonable because we would rather let 100 guilty people go than wrongly convict one innocent person. So we have an unreasonable standard to protect those who might be accused. And we know that, but we can't hold that standard for history because we would never know anything about history. You wouldn't even know anything about your great-grandparents. You're trusting your grandparents for that stuff. And of course, it's okay. That's how we do history. But that's not a reasonable standard for anything else.
So we wanted to briefly go beyond the satire, transition from responding to articles to just some general questions about the resurrection.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Micah, if you wanted to go ahead and take that.
Oh, of course. So, Jim, I'm hearing you talk about the resurrection a lot here. And what is your nutshell case for the resurrection of Jesus as a cold case detective?
I think it's the best explanation for the evidence. Here's what I mean by that. So every time you go into a death scene, you don't know what kind of death it is. It could be a natural, an accidental, a suicide, or a homicide. There's 4 ways to die. You make a case for which kind of death it is based on which of those 4 explanations best explains the evidence you have in the room. That's called abductive reasoning. I think that the Christian claims about the resurrection are the best explanation for even the most minimal evidence that I was willing to agree to as an atheist. I'm not a Jesus myther. I never was. I think there's enough historical evidence to believe that Jesus existed, but I believed he existed, but I was not a Christian. I don't believe Christianity was true. I didn't believe it was true, but I could believe that Jesus existed. I could believe he died on a cross, but lots of people die on a cross. That does not make Christianity true. I believe there was an empty tomb. Because if there wasn't an empty tomb, what's the controversy about? If there was a body for Jesus, we'd be done by now. The easiest thing you could do in the first century to end it is just get the body of Jesus. But nobody could ever do that. So there's a missing body and there's an empty tomb. But that does not by itself make Christianity true. I can believe all of those things so far and still not be a Christian. And I believe that there were people who said they saw the risen Christ. Lots of people say all kinds of crazy things. So I believed those 4 things. Jesus lived, died on a cross, the tomb is empty, and people said he rose from the grave. Yet I thought Christianity was false. But I would have to give you those 4 things and explain them some way. So what I did was I wrote a list of all the ways to explain it. Here they are. Basically, maybe they lied about it. Maybe they were wrong. He wasn't really dead. Maybe they hallucinated it. Maybe somebody sat in as an imposter. Maybe the story of the resurrection just evolved over time. Maybe somebody who had influence convinced the others of something that he saw, only he saw. Or number 7, maybe it just happened. Those are the 7 possibilities. 6, I could hold as an atheist. 1 is the Christian explanation. I just went through all 7 in my research, and it turns out all of them have deal killers. All of them don't work, which is, by the way, why there are 7. There used to only be 6, but Bart Ehrman decided to add a new one a couple of years back. Why did he do that? Because he knows the other ones don't work. That's the problem, is that everyone who holds to number 2 thinks you're crazy to hold to 1, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and 7. Everyone who holds to number 4 thinks you're crazy to hold number 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, or 7. They don't agree with each other because they know they don't work. But it turns out the only problem with the Christian explanation, and there's a problem with it, is that it requires a resurrection. And I would have rejected that because I was a very committed philosophical naturalist. I would have said the weakness, yes, your explanation, it does describe everything else really well, but it suffers this weakness. It requires something miraculous to occur. But then I realized, as an atheist, I already believe in something extra natural. I believe the entire universe came into existence from nothing. That's called Big Bang cosmology, the standard cosmological model. All space, time, and matter came into existence when the universe came into existence, and it came into existence from nothing. There was no matter, space, or time before space, time, and matter. But that means whatever the cause is, it's outside of space, time, and matter. Oh, you already believe in something extra natural, don't you? You believe there's a cause to the natural universe that sits outside of nature. Well, if you believe there's something like that, there's no big miracles in the New Testament. The only big miracle is Genesis 1. Everything from nothing. Everything in the New Testament is what I call a small potato miracle. These are not big deals. If there's a God who could create everything from nothing, he could probably rise from the grave. He could probably walk on water. He could probably feed 5,000. That's not a big deal. If there's a God who can create everything from nothing, well, so I just needed to open my hand to that liability. I thought that was a weakness, but it turns out I already believe there's something outside of space, time, and matter. So why am I rejecting this explanation?
Then if that's the case, then what do you think personally, just out of curiosity, I know it's common knowledge that you believe, what do you think is the strongest objection or excuse for that, even if it doesn't make any sense? Like, what do you think is the best alternative theory to the resurrection? Because you had to probably narrow them down.
Yeah, I think either I think probably that they lied about it and they lie, and you see this all the time. But the Gospels are written really late. Remember, the way to lie about Jesus is just to wait until everyone knows the truth is dead. So if I write these late, it's easier to lie about it. There's no one that would call me a liar. So that's why when you hear someone say, well, these are not written by eyewitnesses and they're written centuries late, that's because they think they contain lies. And you wouldn't catch them because they were written so late. So I still think that's probably where most people would sit, that they are lies. But that's why I spent time as a new investigator of the scriptures trying to figure out how early these were written. Because it turns out that that's what makes the lie unreasonable. If these are written within the lifetime of eyewitnesses, it's hard to lie. It turns out that the early dating of the Gospels solves a lot of other conundrums because it makes it really hard to lie about things because they're written too early. And they're not just written at a time when eyewitnesses could have written them. They're written at a time when people who would know otherwise could debunk.
I've thought about that if the Gospels date late, that would be a serious problem for the case for the resurrection.
I think you're right. I think there's 4 things, right, that are required when you test an eyewitness. Number 1, were you really an eyewitness? Were you really there to see what you said you saw? That's the first criteria. And if they're written hundreds of years after the fact, they fail immediately. They may contain some truth, but you can't call them eyewitness accounts. So the first test for me is how early were they written?
Well, thank you so much. Where can our listeners find you? Where do you want us to point them to if they want to find more of your Beyond the Satire approach?
Okay, so I think just go to coldcasechristianity.com. For example, when you and I were talking about the shape of the cross, I don't remember the 5-page blog I wrote on this, probably, I don't know how many years ago now. It's posted from 2018. I think I probably wrote it 5 years before that and just reposted it. So how do I'm also trying to remind myself of certain minutia and details. Well, I refer to my own website most of the time because I know I've examined it in the past. I just have forgotten what I found. So I constantly am going back to coldcasechristianity.com, and I'm using the same search bar everybody else is to pull up something from years ago. There's stuff that I wrote here 20 years ago that I just keep on reposting, updating it and reposting. So I don't remember all those details. Nobody can remember all of this, but I think it's important for everyone to have wrestled with it. Once you've wrestled with it, then it's probably natural that you're not going to remember every detail. So once you've wrestled with something and you wrote it all out and you wrote a 10-page paper, okay, it's clear in my mind now, and I've put that issue to bed. Well, 5 years from now, if I said, well, what was in your 10-page paper? You're like, well, let me just pull it out because I don't remember, but I no longer worry about it. I no longer think about it. And it's reasonable that I no longer think about it because I did at one point wrestle with it and research it. So I think it's absolutely fine if we do the work and then have to refer to our own writings. And that's why I want to encourage everyone to do the work. Like, it's great to have a place where I've done the work, but where's your place? Everyone needs a your place. For a lot of years before I had a website, it was pieces of paper I had jammed in my Bible, where I had taken copious notes and worked through these issues and made an outline for myself and stuck it in my note. And those became my first blogs because it was like, okay, I don't want to share this with other people. But where are you guys taking those notes? I just want to encourage you to start doing your own research, which you already have, because now you're just spinning it in satire. So that's good. And I also want to encourage you guys, at the age that you are right now, you got a really good early start. Imagine doing this in 10 years. You'll be in your 20s, late 20s, and you will be ready to do a bunch of cool stuff. And you'll be a 10-year apologist, a 10-year case maker. That's pretty amazing if you think about it. So keep up the good work. All right.
Well, we really appreciate the support.
Well, that wraps up the latest edition of the world's one and only apologetics satire podcast. We want to thank J. Warner Wallace again for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. I appreciate it. Let's do it again.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode of the Rock Solid Apologia podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, go ahead and like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Also, go ahead and share with us in the comments how you found out about us. We'll see you next time on the next episode of the Rock Solid Apologia podcast.